then let's start. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a beautiful Saturday. Eventually, the sun is coming through. Welcome on behalf of the whole committee on the third lecture of the Kaiser Spring Lecture. Over the past months, we've worked really hard and really enjoyed organizing 4 great lectures for you guys. And therefore, we're super excited to see this room filled again with people who are interested in astronomy and these lectures. This year, the theme of the Kaiser Spring Lectures is the circle of life, from the beginning of the universe to the formation of life. The 4 lectures are related to this topic, and the speakers, they take us on a journey. We started from a philosophical point of view 2 weeks ago already, and then our journey continued to the beginning of the cosmos, which was last week. And now we're going to the building blocks of the universe, which was resolved in the origin of stars and planets, which will be this lecture, and onto the search for extraterrestrial life, which will be next lecture. A general point before we begin, there will be room for questions at the end of the lecture. Now onto the lecture today. For our existence, water is crucial. So a logical question would then be, how is it formed? How is it formed in the universe? And why is it important to know how it is formed? And this key information and the formation of these molecules will be discussed today. And our speaker will tell you all about this. Welcome, Nienke. The lecturer of her lecture is titled Building Blocks and Molecules in the Universe. She has a PhD in astronomy from Leiden and is now also an assistant professor in Leiden. Her research is focused on the formation of planets in protoplanetary disks. Furthermore, she works with the ALMA telescope, analyzing both molecular line and continuum data. She takes us to the next point in our circle of life, which is the 3rd lecture in our series, and we really hope you all enjoy it. I would now like to give the floor to Nienke and wish you lots of fun with it.
Amplification. Yeah, she has a microphone.
I don't have a microphone, but I can put it. It's one of these. Sorry.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to this 3rd lecture about building molecules in the universe. Okay, here we go. So I want to start with a very famous quote from Carl Sagan, famous astronomer. And the quote says, "We are made of star stuff. Our bodies are made of star stuff. They're pieces of the stars within us all." I'm sure you've heard this quote before, and there's really a lot of basically a lot of science, but also a lot of science behind all of it, a lot of philosophy behind all of that, like the fact that we exist because of the stars in the universe. Because if we look at the periodic table, this is the table that I hope all of you have seen in your chemistry class. We see all these different elements and the different rows, the different columns, they all have these different properties. And then it's good to realize that most of these elements wouldn't have been here if it hadn't been for the stars. So this is the same periodic table, but now with some color coding of how all these different elements have formed. And as you can see, only hydrogen and helium were caused by the Big Bang. Essentially, were formed when the Big Bang happened. Then beryllium and boron were formed in combination with cosmic rays. But then all these other elements were essentially the result of stars.
So you have the low mass stars that had fusion in their core, and by the time that they die, they shoot these elements back into the universe. The green elements, which are essentially heavier, which originate from massive stars. The blue elements from exploding white dwarfs. So after the star has died and even more heavy elements is formed, we end up there. And we even have a lot of elements, basically all the red ones, that come from merging neutron stars. So all the elements that we know that we are made of, also as humans, as Earth, originate from stars. And this is what Carl Sagan did. And it's so this picture illustrates then basically how that happens. How do these elements get formed in the star? So as you know, star radiates because of nuclear fusion, and since the density is the highest in the core, the heaviest elements can form there, like iron, silicon, oxygen, carbon, and in the outer layers, helium and hydrogen. So essentially after the star dies and sheds its layers, it returns all these elements into the universe and then form the next generation of stars and maybe even planets that are enriched by all of these components. Then you actually end up with a periodic table that looks like this. So this one is a little bit more scaled to how often elements occur in the universe. It looks quite different than the one from your chemistry high school, because really the majority of elements, the majority of molecules in the universe consist of hydrogen. Then there's quite a bit of helium as well, and then there's only tiny amounts of things like carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, a bit of silicium, a little bit of sulfur, iron, magnesium. But we're really talking like 10 to the minus 4, 10 to the minus 5, so 10,000 to 100,000 times less than hydrogen. So these are the essential building blocks that we have for making molecules. Mostly hydrogen and then tiny bits of the other elements. Well, if we have these elements, these atoms, they can, in certain combinations, they can stick together, forming what we call molecules. So a molecule is essentially a structure that consists of 2 or more atoms that are linked together. So for example, we have molecular hydrogen, consists of 2 hydrogen atoms. Water consists of an oxygen atom with 2 hydrogen, CO2, carbon dioxide, carbon with 2 oxygen, etc., etc. So this is, just to clarify, this is a molecule, this is an element or an atom. Okay. So these molecules are formed in these beautiful clouds, like this is the Horsehead Nebula that I think you may have seen before. These are the clouds where stars are being born. Because these are the regions where material is clumping together, where the density becomes slightly higher. So you actually have this opportunity for atoms to meet each other and combine and form a molecule. And so you essentially get this cycle of like we are star stuff. It actually starts in the upper left corner, like the Big Bang, a visualization of what the Big Bang could look like. Where these first elements were formed. Then in the first stars, we got the more massive atoms and elements, and these atoms end up in these clouds. They start to clump together, forming the first molecules. Molecules meeting other molecules, becoming larger molecules, until we're really talking orders of magnitude here, clumping many molecules together. We get to DNA, and then eventually us, or our neighbors. So this is where that quote comes from. We are stardust. We are star stuff. We are the result of this really long cycle of more and more complexity, essentially, in the universe. And so now, yeah, the question that you may have is, if all these molecules are formed in these clouds, how did they actually end up? How did they end up in us, right? We are living on planets. We're going to hear much more of planets next week. But somehow these molecules must be incorporated in the planet formation process and then stay there, and then eventually develop into larger molecules, amino acids, DNA, RNA, creating life. So this is basically what I want to talk about a little bit more today. And yeah, this actually starts with this movie that shows what is happening inside these clouds. There's a movie from ESO. No? There's a little, yeah, there is music. It's not very loud. So in this movie, we are looking at one of these star-forming clouds, these clouds that are collapsing and forming the beginning of a star, a protostar. We're zooming into the densest regions of these clouds where the first stars are being born. And we go deeper and deeper. Remember, we're traveling through all the dust until we end up until we have reached that young star. The young star is surrounded by a disk made of gas and dust. It's like a pancake that is formed because of essentially conservation of angular momentum. And in this disk, if we look into it further, we see all these dust particles. Okay, now we're still there. Yeah, we zoom in further, we see all these dust particles in the disk. The dust particles are thought to collide together, growing larger and larger over time, and in this way, eventually becoming planets. So what we think is that these molecules that form already in these clouds eventually are incorporated in planets as part of the star and planet formation process. And what is really that was for me. What is really interesting about this field is that it's very young. 100 years ago, we didn't know yet about star formation. We didn't know that stars were actually still being born in the universe. So there was already this idea that maybe the sun and the solar system came forth out of the solar nebula, but there was nobody thought that stars are still forming at this very moment elsewhere. And I can show this to you with this book. It's actually a book I have at home. Sorry, it's a Dutch translation of an English book, Through Space and Time, for those of you who are not Dutch, written by Sir James Webb. And what is so cool about this book is that it was written in 1935. So it's about 90 years old. And it describes what we knew about astronomy at that time. And as it turned out, that was very little. So if we look at the table of contents, and again, apologies, this is in Dutch, but I'll translate for you. The table of contents says, okay, like preface, list of figures, and then the different chapters. We have Earth, sky, universe, moon, planets, the sun, the stars, nebulae. That's it. Those were the different objects that we had in the universe at that time. But the nebulae people started to realize that they were interesting and that maybe a nebula was not one object, but that there were different types. So the nebulae that they knew about back then were, for example, these ones. These are planetary nebulae. So as you might know, these are the remnants of supernovae. So or remnants of a white dwarf explosion. So after the star has exploded, it sheds its layers, and you get this large extended structure. So here are some updated figures of the exact same object. It's not just the colors; also the figures are really a lot sharper. And obviously, we know a lot more about these objects by now. But it's they essentially describe these planetary nebulae. Oh yeah, this is a nebula that is surrounding a young star. We don't really know what it is that is surrounding a star. We don't know what it is, but it's a nebula. Then they also had these nebula that looked like they were outside the Milky Way and that contained lots of stars. that's literally the description that's in this book. They don't really know what it is, but it contains stars. So it's not something that's surrounding a single star. And if you look at that, you actually recognize some of the very famous galaxies that we know today, like the Andromeda Nebula, the Evaporate Nebula. So these are famous galaxies outside the Milky Way. But back then, they were all kind of grouped together. And then finally, they had these nebulae. And this is the Orion and Auriga. Again, it looks like just a fuzzy structure. And they could also see that there were some stars in there, but it was definitely closer than those galaxies that we saw in the previous figure. But these are actually the star formation clouds, which they didn't know yet at that time. They just noticed like, oh yeah, there's some fuzzy structure and there's some stars in it, and some stars blocked by it, but we don't really know what it was in 1935. So for me, it's incredible to know that this field has developed so much in less than a century. Yeah, so this is essentially how we look at these star formation nebulae. These days, now we can at least put them in colors, and we can study them in so much more detail. We can really look at what kind of structures are there. So we have this beautiful Orion one, we have the pillars of creation, as we call them, these large dust clouds that are blocking or exactly absorbing the light behind them. For which we know now that all of them are essentially clumping of gas and dust, starting to form the first stars. This is another B68 cloud. And then you might have seen this figure last year in the news. This is one of the first images of one of these star formation clouds taken with the James Webb Telescope. And so what all of these cloud images have in common is that they look dusty, right? There's essentially something absorbing the light behind it. And this is even more visible in some, these are Hubble images of some individual stars, also located in Orion, in these clouds. What we see here are actually the first images of disks, dusty disks around the young stars. But all of them show the same aspect, that they're absorbing the light behind it. This is for which you know now that it is the dust in that cloud or in that disk. And what is so what is this dust that we're talking about? So we see this in basically all these images of the star formation, that there's these dark nebulae absorbing the light behind it. They consist of dust particles, and dust particles are a bit like crystals or fractals of lots and lots of molecules that are stuck together. And they were formed, fairly early in the universe, from essentially clumping together of silicium molecules, carbon carbonates, etc. Until they were so large, like these are a micrometer in size, so that's really 10,000 to 100 times larger than a single molecule. And they don't act like a molecule anymore. They don't make a chemical reaction anymore. Instead, they behave like a body that can absorb light and emit light as a whole. This is what we call continuum emission. And the reason that we know that is by actually looking at these clouds in different wavelengths. So if we look in visible light, and these are essentially most of the figures that I was just showing you, we see this absorption, right? So we see that the dust is absorbing the light from behind it. But then when we go to the infrared, and even more if we go to the microwave, we actually see that it's not just absorbing, but also emitting light. And the reason for that is that when absorbing light, a dust grain or a group of dust grains will heat up to a certain temperature and then emit at that temperature that it has reached. Of course, that will never be as high as the temperature of a star, more like 10, yeah, sorry, 10 times lower, even 100 times lower. And therefore it will emit at longer wavelengths. That concept is called a black body. So this plot is demonstrating a black body spectrum. It's essentially the flux as a function of wavelength. We know that the sun has a temperature of about 6,000 Kelvin. You see that the curve of the sun is the yellow curve. It looks a bit like an asymmetric bell curve. And it has a peak right here in the visible. Hey, that's a coincidence. That's also the light that we can see with our eyes. Now, of course, that's not coincidence. Our eyes have adapted to the light of our sun. If our sun was only 3,000 Kelvin, our eyes would probably be more sensitive to infrared light. Because as you can see, this black body, the property of this black body spectrum is that the peak shifts with temperature. So if we go to 3,000 Kelvin, the peak is now at 1 micrometer. So now we're already in the infrared. And we go further and further. Let's say we go to 300 Kelvin. Now the peak is at 10 microns. The clouds of dust and gas in which stars are forming are usually 20 or even 10 Kelvin in temperature. There's very little radiation. There's very little that can heat up these clouds. So therefore, they will emit mostly in the microwave. And that's the essence of the black body and the essence of how dust emits radiation. Then, as I mentioned, the cloud doesn't only consist of dust, it also consists of gas or molecules, what we talked about in the beginning. And so you may wonder, like, how do molecules emit light? Well, the way that this works, it's actually quantum mechanics. I'm just going to briefly explain it, and if you don't fully understand, don't it's not like crucial for the story. Molecules or like a box of gas that has a certain temperature, that implies that the molecules will move around. The temperature was 0, they would all be stuck. If molecules are moving around randomly, they will sometimes collide with each other. When they collide, energy is transmitted from one molecule to the next. So essentially, you bring the molecule in an excited quantum state. In most cases, the molecule wants to go back to the ground state as soon as possible. So it will go back in energy by emitting a photon, a light particle. That light particle will have an energy that is very specific for that molecule. So that means if you have a certain molecule, it will, or a box of gas with a certain molecule, it will emit light at one very specific frequency. This is called a spectral line. And we see here an example of that. So this is a spectrum. It's again flux as function of wavelength, but now in a very small part, like it's highly zoomed in. And as you can see, there are many, many lines within the spectrum. Within the spectrum, you can even see it better in these specific parts where they zoom in. Where we see an emission line, for example, here from water. Here, there's actually a series of lines all originating from the Cl molecule and the CO2 molecule. And essentially, this mechanism, this collisional excitation, results in the fingerprint. That means that if we take a spectrum, we measure where these lines are, we can always look up what molecule creates this line. So if we take the spectrum, we can determine the composition of whatever it is that we're looking at. So that's how molecules work and how we can study them. And yeah, so what is so interesting about astrochemistry? I already mentioned that we didn't know that stars were still forming 100 years ago. But we also didn't know that molecules were still forming in the universe. And it was actually the first molecules in the universe were discovered in 1937, 1940. These were CH plus CN. It was in the optical with the Mount Wilson telescope. Then well, almost 30 years later, 30, 40 years later, some larger molecules like water, formaldehyde, that's H2CO, and ammonia were discovered with in radio observations. And then it was essentially not till the late 80s, 90s, 2000s when we got many more telescopes like ISO, Spitzer, Herschel, ALMA, James Webb, that we started to discover everything else. Like all the other molecules that we found in the universe, it's mostly work from the last 30 years or so. And certainly that first discovery, that was a really big surprise. People saw the lines in the spectrum and they were like, nah, that cannot be a molecule. It's impossible. And the reason for that was this. The universe is very empty. And even those clouds are really, really low density. If we go to like this picture of how a star forms, remember we start with this cloud, this diffuse cloud of gas and dust that will collapse. You get a dense cloud with a protostar, and then during the collapse, a disk is formed that is rotating around the protostar. In the disk, eventually planets form, and then actually the cycle continues where eventually the star dies and explodes all the material away. If we now take a look at the physical properties of these different moments in the lifetime of the birth of the star, yeah, these are the numbers that we find. So in a diffuse cloud, temperatures are like about 100 Kelvin, so it's like 170 degrees, minus 170 degrees Celsius. Density is only 100 particles per cubic centimeter. In the dense cloud, things get a little better, but the temperature goes down because of the higher density. And but the density goes up to 10,000 to about 100 million particles per cubic centimeter. When I say particles, I mean molecules. Then in a disk, things get even better. Because now we have a star in the middle that is actually radiating, so we get large temperature gradients. In the outer part, it's still only 10 Kelvin. Inner part, we get up to 1,000. And the densities go up to, where are we now? 10,000 billion. I don't know, 10 with 13 zeros. I don't know how to particles per cubic centimeter. So that sounds like a lot, right? It sounds like, oh, now we're getting it at a reasonable density. Yeah, of course there's gaps. But no, that was this really big surprise that molecules were found. And the reason for that is these are the densities on Earth. This is the density in the atmosphere. So at sort of room temperature, so 300 Kelvin, we have 10 to the 19 particles per cubic centimeter. This is in the air, right? This is not in a high pressure chamber. This is like in this room. So the idea that atoms could collide with each other and molecules could collide with each other, forming other molecules and also emitting radiation, that was almost unthinkable that would happen in the universe because of these conditions. Well, if I haven't convinced you yet with all these zeros, I do have an example that may illustrate it as well. Like how low this density really is in star-forming clouds. So say that we have a ball pit, balbak in Dutch, like 10 by 10 meters. It fits about 70,000 little plastic balls. If we now want to say, and this represents the density in the Earth, in the Earth atmosphere. If we now scale that down to the density in a star-forming cloud, we take one ball in that entire ball pit. We actually have to cut it into 1 million pieces. Then we have the same density. So we're really talking so many orders of magnitude, so many factors of 10. So so I started with this example and I realized, okay, this doesn't really work. So let's try something else. Let's try sand grains. So sand grains are 50 micrometer in size, so pretty tiny, really tiny. And we fill up the ball pit now with sand. And this represents the density of molecules on Earth. And now we're gonna compare that with the density in the cloud. Only 3 grains, 3 tiny 50 micrometer sized grains in that entire ball pit. So yeah, densities in the universe are low, even in those clouds that we see them as, oh, these are the regions where stars are formed. It must be really dense. Well, it's actually, there's very little material there. Things are happening very slowly. And again, this is why it seems so unlikely that there will be an active chemistry happening there. Well, the reason or the way that we could explain this active chemistry anyway is actually because of the dust grains that are present there. So it's the fact that there's not just gas present, but also dust. And the reason is that these dust particles, if they are located in a very cold environment, remember we were talking like 10, 20 Kelvin, very close to absolute zero, any molecule that is there will quickly freeze out onto that dust grain. And that means you quickly get a layer of water ice, methanol ice, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and even larger molecules. And the reason that you get larger molecules is because the dust grain works as a catalyzer. It's a location where molecules can freeze out and then they sit there. And when they get bombarded with more atoms, more molecules, or even radiation, that can process to larger and larger molecules. It will stay in the ice initially, but in this way you can enhance chemical reactions because there is this sort of moment of peace, almost like this location where molecules can sit and wait till another molecule ends them. The chances of 2 molecules randomly hitting each other in a gas cloud is much lower than if you have a location where a lot of material is gathered and it's just bombarded continuously. So essentially, all these dust grains in the cold clouds are covered with these icy layers. And I have maybe as a result of that, following that, these icy layers can be radiated with photons, with ultraviolet photons or infrared photons. And this can enhance the chemistry even further. Some chemical reactions require UV radiation or even cosmic rays. And finally, when these icy dust grains move to a location where things are a little bit warmer, they will evaporate their icy layers, including all these more complex molecules. This is the way to enhance chemical complexity in space. I have another little movie showing that. This one doesn't have music. Yeah, so here we have a tiny dust grain. And remember, it's not fully up to scale, but this is representing the surface of the dust grain with all the little elements, little molecules that are slowly moving across the surface. And every now and then, some atom or molecule from space will hit the surface, and then they even hit or move around the surface to hit one another. This way, you grow larger and larger molecules. And don't worry, it's going to speed up soon. Thanks, there we go. I was waiting for that to happen. So if you speed up this process, if you wait long enough, essentially, you cover your whole dust grain with this icy layer with more and more complex molecules. And like I said, enhance the chemical complexity. And yeah, as I mentioned, as soon as you have this icy layer, you can this will follow up with further chemical processing, like hitting of other atoms, gas phase bombardment, desorption by the radiation, desorption by photons, and this way creates all of these molecules that we see now today. And I just want to mention this briefly, what is really cool about this field of astrochemistry, in particular the ices, is that this is actually something that we can simulate in a laboratory. So here in Leiden, we have an astrochemistry lab I've actually done my bachelor project there a long time ago, where it is possible to, you use a vacuum chamber, low density. This is still pretty high density compared to the universe, but okay, we call it low density. And we cool it down to low temperatures. We freeze out molecules onto a substrate, and then we can take example spectra of, for example, a mixture of 3 different molecules. Look at how all these spectral features look like, how they are in comparison with each other, and then compare that with the spectra that we take in space. This is work that's actively being done right now also here in Leiden. Another component of astrochemistry is computer simulations. And because, as you can imagine, a molecular network quickly gets really complicated. If you have one molecule, you add another atom, you add another molecule, you add a photon, you bombard it with radiation, a lot of different things can happen. And all these chemical reactions happen at different speed. And you end up with something that looks like this. Like, say you have one molecule, if it gets hit by this, if it gets hit by hydrogen, it becomes this molecule, but if it gets hit by so there's simply many different possibilities. And in order to calculate that, we also rely a lot on computer simulations to see, like, what is the end result based on the speed of all these different chemical reactions. And what's so interesting about this is that even though we know now that chemistry happens, and like we have this ice that really helps us a lot, things still happen very differently than what we're used to here on Earth. So I think, like, even just before this talk, I was talking with some students like, oh yeah, I never had chemistry in high school. Like, yeah, but it doesn't really help in astrochemistry because astrochemistry is so different, so non-intuitive for, us Earth chemists, that it's actually better to go into this field with an open mindset where you don't have a clue what's going on, because you would have a hard time predicting if you're used to Earth-based chemistry. Okay, so I want to show you a number of the really beautiful results that we've found so far with various telescopes. So about, let's see, 9, so we're like 15 years ago, the Herschel Space Telescope was launched. This was a telescope operating in the far infrared, and it was able to take these very, very detailed spectra of some of these nearby star-forming clouds. This is just an example, and here zoom in windows of these super complicated spectra, where they're able to recognize all these different fingerprints of these molecules, like, well, there's carbon monoxide and water, but also something called deuterium cyanide, dimethyl ether. Don't worry, you don't have to remember all this, but yeah, the chemical complexity of these clouds turned out to be enormous. And we're still trying to figure out, like, can we explain the existence of all of these molecules, and also the relative existence of all of these molecules? Do they make sense? And what do they tell us about the conditions in that cloud? Right? We're not just interested in what molecules are there and what does that mean for, creating life at some point. But we can also use the molecules to say, oh, well, if this molecule exists and this molecule exists, and in this ratio, then the temperature must be this and this. That's weird. We always thought the temperature was much lower, or we thought the temperature was much higher. So molecules can also be used as a way to trace physics. Another example is that certain molecules can only occur under the influence of intense radiation. So maybe that radiation is no longer there now, like cosmic rays, for example, but it must have been there in the past. So they can also tell us something about the history of a cloud. But obviously, those kind of studies become very extensive because you have simply so many molecules you need to take into account. Then another big discovery was made with a water emission line. And this water emission line was found in a protostar that was very young, that was also emitting a jet, a bipolar jet in 2 directions. This is part of the early stages of star formation when material and energy is also being emitted in that vertical direction. They actually measured the waterline at velocities of 200 kilometers per second. So in the, sorry?
Per hour.
Is per hour? Sorry, 200 kilometers, thank you, 200 kilometers per hour. I will need to calculate that in a second. And this is comparable to the velocity of a bullet coming out of a gun. So this was, back then they dubbed this molecular bullets. So the way the material is being ejected from the star is comparable to the power that comes out of a rifle. So that here we actually used the water as a way to trace some of the kinematics in the system. Then the ALMA telescope. So I was already mentioned this, the telescope that I've been working with mostly during my career. The ALMA is an array of telescopes that work together to create really sharp images of the universe. And so some of the things that ALMA have done, again, these forests of molecular lines. This is again a protostar, proto-binary actually. So it's two stars that are orbiting each other. Take one spectrum of this system, and this is how it looks like. It's a forest of lines. We're talking hundreds, if not thousands of lines. Many of them are not even identified. Like we don't even know what they are yet. Again, this is just proving the chemical complexity, but also years and years of work of figuring out what's happening here. And it definitely proves that a lot of the building blocks of life are already present at this early stage when the star is only just being born. Then so one particular case, this was a press release several years ago, they discovered glycoaldehyde, which is a type of sugar. They found that in space. And this was a very specific example, but I think one of the first examples, really showing that this process of a dusty grain, having some molecule, an icy layer of a few molecules being irradiated, creating these larger molecules and eventually evaporating those molecules again. That this was happening. This is the reason why we would be able to find sugar in the system. And yeah, essentially this also led to this other picture that you can essentially build cocktails in space because all the main ingredients like sugar, alcohol, components are already there. Then the sort of interesting question, I guess, certainly in my case, because it's my field, is all these molecules that are present in the cloud, do they actually end up on the planets when they're forming, right? So remember, we've seen this figure before. We have the cloud collapse, the protostar, and then the accretion disk around that protostar. Are all those molecules simply taking along and eventually end up in the disk, accreting onto the planets? You know, that's when dust grains stick together, forming a planet. Or not, because you've seen that in these early stages of the protostar, there are these energetic jets. Then also the disk itself actually has a really strong temperature gradient. It's very hot in the center part, very cold in the outer part. For a long time, it wasn't very clear if the molecules from the early stage actually survive, if the clouds are representative for the conditions on a planet that's forming this disk. So as I mentioned, we have this really strong temperature gradient. We have the star in the middle of the disk, where the edge of the disk, the inner edge of the disk becomes 1,000, 2,000 Kelvin, the outer edge as low as 10 Kelvin. And this is more like a graphic representation of the processes in the disk. In the inner part, we have the 1,500 Kelvin, this is the edge. Inside this inner region, materials are accreting onto the star, creating even more radiation field like UV and X-ray radiation. And then if we go further out, you actually have all these different layers in the disk. like the surface layer, we call it photon dominated. So this is where there's lots of photons hitting the gas, hitting the dust, changing the chemistry, and actually ionizing a lot of the molecules as well. So kicking out electrons from molecules as well. Then the layer below that, we tend to think of that as the molecular layer. Like this is where most molecules survive. They don't become destroyed. They don't freeze out. And then below that, we have the layer where molecules will freeze out because the temperatures become so low and the density is so high that the chances are higher that a molecule ends up on a dust grain instead of in the gas. And then on the other hand, I won't go into too much detail because that's the topic of this talk, but we have all these processes happening in the disk, like the settling of dust grains. Like a lot of dust grains end up in the midplane, giant planet formation, grain growth, turbulence, like things getting mixed in the vertical direction. All these processes are happening simultaneously, and we're still trying to figure out the efficiency of all of that. So in this whole turbulent, super complicated 3D structure, chemistry must be happening as well. And therefore, we don't know if the molecules that we're measuring in the disk are actually the same ones, if they're inherited from the clouds, or if basically everything gets destroyed and sort of reforms at this stage before it ends up on the clouds. So just a couple of examples of ALMA studies of disks. This is a famous disk called Cedar Hydra, where it was found that the carbon monoxide emission is centrally peaked. So carbon monoxide exists mostly in the center parts and then drops off outwards. While the N2H plus looks like a ring. So without knowing anything of the chemistry, that's a little weird, right? Like, why would the N2H plus not be at the same location of the CO? Well, it turns out that N2H plus is a molecule that can only form efficiently if CO is frozen out onto the dust grains. And that happens at a temperature of around 30 Kelvin. So what we're looking at here is really a snow line in the disk. So here's the inner part. This is where the temperatures are above 30 Kelvin. This is where the CO can survive. And then as soon as the temperature drops below 30 Kelvin, the CO will freeze out of the dust grains. And then N2H plus is a molecule that doesn't get destroyed by CO anymore. But in a way, this gives us a direct indicator of where the temperature drop is, where this snow line is. And so the reason why snow lines are so interesting in astronomy, especially in planet formation, is actually because of the solar system. Because in the solar system, we have noticed already, long before we knew anything about disks and stars, that the rocky planets are located inside the so-called snow line or frost line. The location where water freezes out onto dust grains. The giant planets are located outside this frost line. And for a really long time, people thought this is not a coincidence. The reason the giant planets are located here is because all the dust grains are covered in water ice. Therefore, they grow more efficiently, they stick together more easily, and that's how you can grow to really large planets. And everything inside the frost line, yeah, it's warmer, it doesn't stick together that well, so therefore you can only form rocky planets. So for a long time, this was dominating the ideas of planet formation. We know now that this is not true, because we know that exoplanets look completely different than the solar system. But as a concept, this is in itself, this is really interesting. Now we actually have to figure out why this is not working that way, because it seems logical, right? That if you have more ice, if things stick together, that you would have more efficient growth. Apparently, that's not the case, because then exoplanets would all look the same as the solar system. But this is a topic for next week. You can ask me else about it. Then a discovery that I made last year in Leiden was this. That was actually really cool. So we were studying this disk called RS-48, which has a concentration of millimeter dust on one side of the disk. So the disk itself is just a ring of gas and dust, but the large dust grains are all concentrated on one side. We found that this molecule, CH3OCH3, dimethyl ether, the emission of that molecule also originates from the southern part of the disk. It was actually at the exact same location as the millimeter dust. So this will direct proof that this complex molecule must originate from the ices on these millimeter grains. And that, I mean, it sounds obvious perhaps, but this is proof that the complex molecules are still there in the disk phase. They are not fully destroyed. They must survive from the transition from the cloud phase to the disk phase. And then, since this is also a location where the millimeter dust grains are gathering, maybe forming a planet, these molecules may also end up on that planet. It was a really important discovery for our understanding of what happens to molecules after the cloud has collapsed. They actually survive. Quite a similar conclusion. This was a Nature paper last week, so you may even have seen this on 2 weeks ago. Sorry, you may even have seen this on the news. So they made measurements of water emission in a disk, V883 and they measured the ratio between deuterated water, H2O, and regular water, so heavy water and regular water. And these measurements have been made before for comets in our solar system, for young protostars, and they were found to be similar. And now they could actually add what the value is in the disk state. So this was, it's all kind of around the same value compared to the values in the interstellar medium, essentially in the clouds where no stars are forming yet. So the fact that they found that this ratio is the same tells us that the water that we have here on Earth, the water that we have in comets, it all originates from that early cloud stage. There is basically no processing. It doesn't change. The complexity is set very early on. It survives the cloud to disk stage, and then the disk to planet and comet stage. All of that chemistry composition is the same. Okay, then finally, the James Webb Space Telescope. Of course, it was only launched fairly recently. You may have seen this beautiful image when it looked back on Earth during the launch. We're now getting our first results from the James Webb Space Telescope. And I just want to show you this really beautiful result for a protostar, so a young star that is still embedded in the cloud, where they were able to measure directly the spectrum of the ices in the protostar. So in the cloud where the protostar is forming. So here you see again the spectrum. Ice features are always in absorption against the bright background. So we see all these dips of emission. These are the spectral lines from the ice. And they found water, CO2, CO, methanol, ammonia, methane, methanol. They found all these different components of the ice that are already present in this early stage that we can now quantify. And so now with these kind of measurements, we actually have proof that molecules really appear in ice form and initially start in ice form. So with that, I've come to the end of my talk. I'd like to end up with a slide from Kelvin Hobbs, where Kelvin screams, "I'm significant," and then realizes that he is just a dust speck. I think made it clear, we're all dust specks, we're all made of stardust, we're all little remnants of all these processes in the universe. But the fact that we have all these great facilities that allow us to study all these different components, all these clouds and disks, and even planets, tell us that maybe we are somewhat significant after all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this amazing and very interesting lecture. And as a thank you, we have a little something. Oh, wow. Thank you. You can, nice. So the notebook. Yeah, I'll look at it. Yes, okay. Last few things. So there will be a tour later on, and the starting point is the Kaiser statue at the entrance. There is still room available for people who would like to join the tour. If you still want to, you can ask one of us to, and we can arrange that for you. And also, if you were already enthusiastic about the lectures or just now, and you want to help us and Kaiser, you can also donate to us, and you can do that at Lente. It's over there. If you want to express your enthusiasm via writing, there's a guest book downstairs. You can also write something small in there, and we really like reading them afterwards. So that would be cool. Thank you for all the attention, and now there's room for questions. And thank you again, Nienke, for the talk. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so we were talking about spectral lines that, first of all, thank you for your talk. Very easy. So you're talking about spectral lines that can be used to identify the matter that's there, right? Mm-hmm. So can we also identify elements that are heavier than what is known currently on Earth in the periodic table? Mm-hmm. So we have identified elements that are heavier?
Well, let's see. So the elements that we know of the periodic table are not necessarily all found in space, like many of them are also found on Earth. Most of the images that I've been shown were the molecules, so they consist of, and most of the molecules consist of the small atoms, so, and essentially the ones that are less massive than iron, simply because these are more common. You remember that I showed this crazy periodic table? It doesn't even mention elements heavier than iron because they are so rare and also not very stable. And most of them disappear quickly because of radioactive decay. So essentially all the molecules that we see in star and planet formation, there are no heavy elements. Sorry, does that answer your question?
Well, so they are probably there, but we just really don't identify them because they're not very abundant.
Yeah, and they wouldn't be bound in a molecule, so we wouldn't be able to do that.
Okay, so basically, then what did you mention with the spectral lines where there were areas of things that we haven't identified yet?
Oh, sorry, I meant, so there are spectral lines, so we haven't associated them with a molecule yet, but so it's not with an element, but with a molecule. Oh, okay. And this is because, well, actually because we don't have tables yet of all the possible complex molecules. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, no, now I understand your question. Yeah, I thought you were asking about the elements.
Yeah. Have there ever been detected amino acids?
Yes. The small versions of it, the molecules that contain nitrogen. Yeah, I think amino acids itself are already much longer strings, but sort of the building blocks of amino acids have been CH3CN is definitely added.
The reactions occur on the surface of dust particles.
Yes.
Do they need an extra source of energy, or are the reactions spontaneously at the temperature?
Depends. So some reactions will happen without additional energy, and others do, and that's where essentially the UV radiation plays a role. This is something that we can also simulate in the lab.
That was my second question.
Yeah.
But you could do that in the lab.
Yeah. There are several experiments that have shown like a certain molecule will only appear if it is radiated with sufficient UV radiation. Yeah, and we expect the same happening in space.
You mentioned that the formation of more giant planets outside the frost line was unlikely because we also find exoplanets now that are close to their star. But could planet migration, giant planets migrating north, not explain this?
Yes, that could happen, but then still the question: why does migration happen in one system and not in the other? So it's like I said, it's an open question. It kind of messes up our classical picture of planet formation.
You discussed the formation of ice on little grains from atoms.
Yeah.
Form really molecules on the surface of such grains, and I was wondering whether the comets that fly in and out of the inner part of our solar system, do they still collect atoms far out, or do they collect only molecular water?
Well, so right now there's no more gas present. So the disk of gas and dust eventually disappears after all the planets are formed. Right. So the current comets are no longer collecting, but the comets are made of the same material. So they are made of these icy dust grains that have clumped together, but they were for some reason not able to grow all the way to planets, which goes into the big question of planet formation. Yeah, I still have 30 years to go before I retire.
By looking at the spectral lines, you identify compounds which there are, but the ratio of intensities, do they tell you about the relative amounts of them, or do you need drastic assumptions about that? Can they be hidden, or?
That's a really good question. So the intensity of a line is a combination of temperature and density. Yeah. Like both a higher temperature and a higher density would increase the amount of collisions and therefore the excitation. Right? So having two molecules, having two lines from two different molecules, the ratio may not give you enough information. You have to assume a temperature in order to calculate the abundance ratio. But as soon as you have multiple lines from the same molecule, that can actually tell you something about its temperature, and then you can disentangle these lines. And luckily, in many cases, we do have multiple lines from the same molecule, and then we can derive it.
Is there a specific line or molecule that you're really looking for, or is it more see what we can find?
That's a good question. Well, so something that I'm interested in right now is, so we found this dimethyl ether, this complex molecule in this one disk. Now we're gonna target other disks for that same, well, dimethyl ether and similar molecules, essentially complex molecules containing carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen, because they're all part of the same class of molecules that can only form in ice and then evaporate. So that is it's actually very interesting that other disks haven't really shown that emission yet. So then it's also the question: why do some disks show it and others are not? It could really be. There could really be a physical explanation for it rather than coincidence.
Maybe related question.
We have still.
Yeah,
don't worry.
Maybe it's a bit related, but you said that from the ALMA data set, you still have a wealth of emission lines to yet identify, and they may be from molecules that don't even form on Earth. So what is your strategy there? You said you had 30 years, not millions, to put in your lab. So can you theoretically, let's say, calculate a molecule and predict its spectrum, and then, or because if you don't have the time to, or what is the strategy to identify?
Yeah. So that is not something that I do, but this is these are really complex quantum mechanical calculations that let's say, like if you have a certain molecule and it's built up, in a certain structure, you should be able to calculate its energy structure and therefore the frequencies where it will emit light. I've never tried, but it seems, I don't know to what level this can be done mathematically. In the lab may actually be so measuring this spectra in the lab. That is something that's also still being done.
You need a lot of time to form them.
But on Earth we can form them. On Earth we can form them more easily, and then we can measure them. Yeah. And then it's actually also a matter of doing or taking the measurements in the lab at the same wavelengths as where we are observing in space. Right? So this is also a part where our knowledge is, or essentially our tables are still lacking information. We know where it emits light in the infrared, but maybe not in some millimeter where ALMA is taking such observation. So yeah, there's still, also experimentally, there's still a lot that can be done there.
I was just wondering, so that picture of the elements and the bonding in a certain way, do we know with the planetary disks, do you have an understanding of the trend there? Or is it very random that we find certain elements and molecules in that development stage?
So you mean the periodic table, right?
Yeah, I mean, so we know in the general universe, we have an idea of elements and lesser with when we have these stars form, and we have the disks with the planets there. Do you have an idea of abundance in those? Is there a trend?
No, so this is something that we're still trying to figure out. Like this measurements that just came out 2 weeks ago, on the heavy water and the regular water. That was actually the first proof that at least that ratio was the same across the whole star transformation process. Before that, we were not sure. This has to do with this whole question about reset versus inheriting from the planet.
There's a certain focus that we have that we're sort of really looking for something.
No, there's simply certain molecules that are, let's say, easier to observe than others. So a lot of work is going into that. But I think it's unrealistic to say that, in 30 years, we will have observed everything, like every molecule, and then we have a full picture. It's always a matter of choosing the best targets and the best molecules for that.
Yeah, I had another question. How far are we looking into the universe when we see molecules? Is it in our Milky Way or also outside?
So everything I've shown you is relatively close. It's 400 parsecs, so like 1200 light years, well within the Milky Way. However, there are also astrochemistry studies in other galaxies. This is something that I think has only become possible with ALMA, so in the last 10 years. And essentially, the galaxy people are starting to develop models to interpret them because they never had to deal with this before. So this is a starting field. To admit, I don't know that much about it, but it's yeah, they are definitely detecting chemical complexity, which makes sense because we expect that star formation happens the same everywhere, just different environments. And now the challenge is to interpret that. Question.
I wonder if you can, in a laboratory circumstances, imitate such a large cloud cold and see all those reactions taking place, and maybe you can spare telescopic time, of course, which is much cheaper.
Well, so we cannot create the densities as low as in the universe, as in these clouds. The lowest densities we can get in the lab are like, I think 10 to the -10 times the Earth's atmosphere. So then we are in the very densest part of the clouds. That's the best we can do. On the other hand, it gives an advantage to work at slightly higher densities, because otherwise we have to wait really long for the thing. You know, the universe has time, but PhD students don't. So.
Thank you again, and thank you all for listening.
Yeah.